Hi, so welcome back to the second part of Dr. B's lecture on consumer culture. The first part of it was about the diamond industry, and now we're in the middle of some examples about different advertisements from the diamond industry that help to promote consumer culture. So we just watched the De Beers advertisement from 1997, and in our class meetings we are likely to discuss these ads and some others like them. It's worth knowing that consumer culture does shift. There isn't one version of it. It's probably consumer cultures. And one place where we can see shifts like this is when circumstances, like economic circumstances for a large portion of the target demographic change, we see advertisers respond to this. So here's an advertisement from De Beers in 2008 during the economic recession at that time period. And it talks about how at the end of the day, you could lose a lot of things, but if you have a few precious items, that's more important to you. So it's still encouraging probably imprudent spending for folks in the middle of economic turmoil. And here it's suggesting, well, buy some diamond rings during the recession. So that's maybe another toxic element of consumer culture we can identify. There's always a way to justify any expense. There have been some rebuttals to the more traditional ways of selling diamonds, and again, we'll discuss some of these in class. They'll be a lot of fun to dig into as a group. One is forever mark, so this is a claim that one can source the provenance of a diamond and prevent concern over diamonds coming from conflict zones or other problematic ways of recovering diamonds. So there are suggested high standards for ethical mining. That's one way that we see people responding to some of the problems with this particular industry. And then we see people coming in with new companies that try and say like, oh, well, you're smarter than De Beers and be smarter with us. So they might offer something with less personal service and more online engagement, so they get rid of the overhead of having a storefront and can save you some percentage of money when you're buying a diamond, but they're still perpetuating things like you should still be spending a lot of money on a diamond. The diamond says a lot about you. The diamond says a lot about your relationship. So it challenges some of the premises from traditional diamond consumption, but it reinforces a lot of the norms about how people exchange gifts and signify their relationships in our society. So this ad, which we'll talk about in class, does also reinforce consumer culture at the same time that it acts like we're in on the joke. So again, something we'll get to in class. And a heads up about some of the discussion questions we'll get to. So who do you think the audience for the new era of diamond advertising is? Does it reinforce consumer culture, and how? What's different from it than De Beers? And would you still buy a diamond piece of jewelry for yourself or a loved one? So we'll get to that in person. Another activity that's more fun in person is this exercise where I take us through the difference between the dictionary definition of something, or its denotation, and its connotation. So denotation is the plain meaning of something, as close to divorced from social norms as possible. And the connotation is like the rich cultural significance of something, including these poetic interpretations that we might have of something too. So we know that a diamond is carbon that is transformed into a shiny crystal shape because of high pressure and high temperature. But the connotation of it in our culture in this current moment has to do with lasting forever, a love that lasts forever. And that's why, in spite of the fact that diamonds have very little commercial value, they have high social value, and we are willing to pay for things that we find culturally valuable. Part of the reason we find them culturally valuable, however, is that we are in a culture that prizes possessions, materialism, commodities, owning the same things that other people own. So here I've got some examples of consumer culture. We've got malls, which are starting to die, and online shopping these days is probably the best example of consumer culture. So I've got my Amazon boxes over here. Those aren't mine, but the ones I chose to show in this image. So when you ask yourself, what is consumer culture? I want you to remember a couple of things. First and foremost, it's a society in which a person's identity has to do with the things they've been able to buy. So purchasing power is part of who you are in a consumer culture. This creates some fairly stark inequalities and stark injustices because not everyone has equal purchasing power. So you are what you buy is part of what it means to exist in a consumer culture. Obviously, you aren't just what you buy, but that's part of how people understand you socially here. Consumer culture is also a culture that emphasizes owning things, replacing them frequently, and having status symbols. So stuff equals status in a consumer culture. Consumerism is a way of life. Advertising and consumer culture go hand in hand in a lot of different ways, some of which we've talked about already. So demand engineering is one of these ways. Create the perception of a need in your public. So lead people to believe they must own a certain kind of product in order to eliminate problems or fix things that are wrong with themselves or the world around them. So demand engineering trains audiences to want items they didn't know they needed, and which they might not in fact need. There's also sophisticated messaging and just really lovely fantasies. So the idea that Woodbury soap had a skin you love to touch, the idea that diamonds represent an everlasting love, all of that's really appealing. And so advertising feeds consumer culture because it tells us these very lovely stories that might be at least partially true for some people. And so that feeds the identity of being a person who must have that thing because that thing is attached to a really lovely set of cultural connotations. There's also the illusion of social proof. So social proof is the idea that we all look around at other people when we're trying to figure out what we're supposed to do. You can see this particularly if you've ever been at a fancy dinner and there are like 12 pieces of silverware in front of you, and you're not sure which fork you're supposed to use for your salad. So what do? You go, okay, everyone else is using the fork farthest on the end, so I'll work my way in. Okay, I figured it out because I was looking at what other people are doing. So social proof is, checking out what other people are doing and then doing that yourself because you've learned, oh, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do. Advertising can trick us. So when we're actually at a dinner table with real people we really are having a meal with, it's okay to be like, oh, what's normal here? What's going on? But advertising lies and says it's your friend. It says that it's there with you at the dinner table when it isn't. It's a company that wants to profit off of you. And so it's like, hey, didn't you know? Everyone spends 2 months' salary on an engagement ring. So if you're looking around like, oh, how much should I spend? Psst, we'll tell you. That's how much. But of course, you can have a really lovely piece of jewelry for hardly any money at all if you're not looking around to see what everyone else is doing. Cultural capital is another thing that these companies do and that advertising does in particular. So cultural capital is your know-how. It's how you go about doing things. So, for example, all those complicated things that have to do with purchasing a diamond, the cut, color, clarity, carat, that stuff, the 4 C's, that is making it more complicated than it had to be to buy a diamond ring. And so advertising teaches you like, well, actually this thing's really complicated, but we'll teach you how to do it correctly. And obviously the correct way to do it ends up netting the company more profit. So they'll teach you like the tools of the trade, all the know-how you need to make a smart decision. And then there's a company profiting off of teaching you that the smartest decision is to spend a little bit more. So this brings us to probably some questions that are heavy on your mind right now because we're talking about being manipulated by storytelling and information gathering and so on. So can advertisers convince us to purchase things we don't want? Maybe. They can introduce the idea that something could be good for you. They can prey on your insecurities. They can tell you there's a problem that you have that you never thought was problematic until they introduce the idea. So they introduce ideas that can have the effect of leading you to buy something you otherwise would not have purchased. However, there's a really famous example called the Edsel. In 1958, this new car came out from Ford, and there was amazing advertising, a really great campaign that came out and encouraged people to go buy it, go check it out, go look at the Edsel. But when people actually saw the car, they all hated it. I mean, not everyone, but very few people ended up purchasing an Edsel. So this is a case where there was compelling advertising encouraging people to buy the darn car, and people didn't do it. So advertising can introduce some insecurities for you. It can teach you that version A of the product, which is more expensive, is superior to version B of the product. But ultimately, if you just don't want something, you're not going to buy it unless you're forced to by other circumstances besides the advertising. Meanwhile, there was the Pet Rock, which came out in 1975. It was $3.75 per Pet Rock. Obviously, this is a stupid product. It's funny, it's a good joke, but it's something that nobody actually needs, that you would only buy as a joke because it makes you laugh. So advertising had something to do with it, but mostly I think it was the sense of humor of people in the mid-1970s. So did advertising make people buy a Pet Rock? No, but did its existence create enough money to turn its inventor into a millionaire? You better believe it did. So when we get these messages about stuff we could buy, sometimes we want it, sometimes we don't. It's not an exact science. I'd say fidget spinners are another thing like this, where parents lately had received a lot of pressure from their children to get them fidget spinners. It's kind of a dumb thing. No one really gets, I mean, some people actually do get a lot out of it because it helps them to have something to do with their hands. It helps them focus and it helps them do other things. But for the majority of people who own fidget spinners, they've probably never used them. They probably don't even really want them, and somehow they have them. So fidget spinner is another example of something like a contemporary pet rock for the majority of the people who consume them. It's a collector's item that just exists for the sake of existing because people like novelty. And finally, here, can advertisements make us want things we don't need? Well, absolutely. But everything happens in a cultural context. So we get persuaded based on what suits us and our identities, our means, what we want to express to the world. So that's it for the consumer culture unit. I'll see you on the flip side.